Okay, good afternoon and thank you all for joining us. I would firstly like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we are all meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today we are very honoured to hear from Commissioner Chin Tan, who will share with us his insights on COVID-19, the rise of racism and what we can do about it. Commissioner Tan commenced his term as Race Discrimination Commissioner on October 8, 2018. Prior to joining the Commission, Chin spent 3 years as Director of Multicultural Engagement at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. Chin's focus at Swinburne as the head of its cultural diversity strategy was to work collaboratively across the university and wider community to ensure that Swinburne succeeded as an institution of cultural diversity excellence. His leadership role resulted in Swinburne on the 23rd of November 2017 being conferred a High Commendation Award by the Victorian Government under the Victorian Multicultural Excellence Awards 2017 Business category. Chin was the chairperson and statutory head of the Victorian Multicultural Commission from 2011 to 2015. The Commission is an independent statutory authority with responsibilities to support and promote the benefits of Victoria's cultural diversity. Previously, he enjoyed a successful career of more than 24 years as a practicing lawyer that included partner roles at a number of Melbourne firms. Chin was the co-chair of the Police and Community Multicultural Advisory Committee and served in many organisations and bodies. This included the Chamber of Commerce, the Australian Football League's Multicultural Focus Group, professional and business associations, and local council committees. He was until recently a member of La Trobe University's Asian Advisory Board and has either led or been a member of many other community organisations. Before I ask the Commissioner to commence, just a reminder that we will have an opportunity for questions at the end and ask that you please send them through at any time through the question box. As we have also received quite a few questions through email and the registration form, I do apologise if we don't have time to get through everyone's questions. I would now like to welcome Commissioner Tan to share the presentation with us. Thank you, Commissioner.
Good afternoon, Samantha. Thank you for having me. I do know now that I need to shorten my bio. It's far too long and it's got too much in it that doesn't do really any good for me. It's just far too long. But I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, recognizing the connection to land and waters and community, to pay my respect to Australia's First Peoples and the elders, past, present, and future. And I obviously want to acknowledge the Migration Council, the board members, the directors, to yourself, Samantha, for inviting me and giving me this honor of speaking to this forum and to the audience, and obviously to the audience members who have seen fit on a day like this to tune in and listen to me. I'm honored. So thank you very much. And I hope we can make some sense of the issues and topic we're talking about, but also to answer some of the questions you have. So I'm going to speak just broadly about 4 hours. Is that okay, Samantha? 4 hours? No, I will endeavor to keep to about 20 minutes, and then we will open up as much opportunity as possible for questions from the audience. So let me start by simply alluding to the questions that have been posed to me to talk about. So I'm going to try to stick to topic if I can. There are 3 issues brought to my attention, of which I think has been expressed to me as being of interest to the audience today. But before I proceed, I thought it might be useful to have a brief overview about racism. It's a topic we all think we know about, and we do by experience, but it's a far more complex and confounding topic than we would like to imagine. And therefore, you might want to explore some terms and concepts that relates to racism. In a nutshell, racism is the unequal treatment of others based on race, pure and simple. So race is an evolving social idea that revolves around the concept that legitimizes racial inequality. Racism can take many forms, such as jokes or comments that cause offense or hurt, sometimes unintentionally, name calling or verbal abuse, harassment or intimidation, or commentary in the media or online that inflames hostility towards certain groups. At its most serious, racism can result in acts of physical abuse and violence. Racism can directly or indirectly exclude people from accessing services or participating in employment, education, sport, or social activities. It can also occur at a systemic or institutional level through the policies, conditions, or practices that disadvantage certain groups. It often manifests through unconscious bias or prejudice. On a structural level, racism serves to perpetuate inequalities and access to power, resources, and opportunities across racial and ethnic groups. The belief that a particular race or ethnicity is inferior or superior to others is sometimes used to justify such inequalities. Prejudice is prejudgment and preconception about a person based on his or her race or ethnicity. Prejudice consists of feelings and thoughts and includes attitudes, perceptions, stereotypes, and generalizations that are based on little or no experience or possibly lots of misconstrued or misconceived experience and directed towards a person from the victim group. All humans have prejudice. No one is immune. Prejudice is also nurtured from the information we gain from our cultural framework. Prejudice invariably always manifests itself in action because the way we think and feel drive our actions. Discrimination is action based on prejudice. If we harbor hatred or serious resentment because of our prejudice, it could translate into extreme acts of discrimination, such as violence. But often discrimination is expressed in a more subtle form, such as discomfort or unease. When the collective prejudice of a racial group is validated, buttressed, and reinforced by the cultural norm of the community and the legal and institutional frameworks, then it becomes racism. Kiau Lani Kau Anui, professor of American Studies and Anthropology at the Wesleyan University, says this: racism is a structure, not an event, unquote. So it means that racism is a system and not merely an act. And that explains why the victims of racism often refer to a system of institutional and ritualized oppression and inequality. So is racism unavoidably embedded in the fabric of our society? And have we seen an increase of racism as a result of COVID-19? So turning to the first question that is posed to me, do we or have we seen a particular increase of racism due to COVID-19, particularly aimed at the Asian Australian communities? The short answer is a difficult one because we don't have enough data to back that or support that. But there is a general consensus and view that we have seen an increase in racism against Asian Australians due to the pandemic. Since the pandemic began, there has been substantial media reporting about incidents of racial abuse that has been targeting Asian Australians. The Online Hate Prevention Institute, for example, has observed an increase in racism against Asian Australians online. And the many incidents reported to the Asian Australian Alliance and other bodies monitoring racial abuse provide further evidence of the increase. In addition, our own complaints data, which is to be careful about, is the fact that it's very limited in scope and numbers. it does help us capture some information about the increase in abuse that has been directed at Asian Australians. From February to June this year, 1/3 of all complaints made to the Commission under the Racial Discrimination Act has been in relation to COVID-19. But mind you, there aren't huge numbers, but in terms of statistics, they do show an increase in numbers of complaints that are based on COVID-19. And February, for example, saw a substantial increase in racism complaints to the Commission. And as the Race Discrimination Commissioner and as a member and leader of the Chinese community in Australia, I've heard and I've come across a number of community members who have made an issue and reported on issues that relate to COVID-19 racism, including people who have been threatened and assaulted in public places. And this is in addition to reports that I've received from Chinese community groups. They do point to an increase in racial incidents against Asian Australians, particularly directed towards the Chinese. And my own experience has been that, and obviously the first question that might want to be asked about me is if I personally experienced racism, not in the overt sense, I have not, but it doesn't help that when we're talking about an issue that relates to a person's sense of belonging, sense of security, there are moments that even for me as commissioner, when I felt a little bit unwelcome in some places. An experience I had going to the airport in February, one of the last trips I went to Sydney before I was actually isolated in Melbourne, which is where I live, has been a eye-opening experience for me in that going to the airport lounge, I felt that I didn't belong. I felt I had to explain to people that it was the beginning of COVID-19, that I was very careful not to sneeze or to anything that may give any implication or alarm to anyone that I might be carrying a virus. And nothing more than simply because for me it was I'm Chinese and I've got to be careful about the way in fact others might regard me. And that for me, it sends a clear message about that sense of belonging, that unease, that discomfort that comes not because you were abused physically or there was any harassment directed at me, but this innate sense from that social setting about your place of belonging. And that too is a form of racism about how we deal with issues right across, and the sense of belonging that people have. And that sense of place are terribly important when we seek to combat racism in all its forms. So, it comes down to largely, I suppose, an indication that yes, there is and has been an increase in racism, and much of that has been directed at Asian Australians, particularly Chinese Australians. And it is concerning for the overall social cohesion of our country when members of our community question their sense of belonging in Australia. And it is a failure on the connective nature of our broader Australian community and our government and our society as a whole if this trend is not addressed quickly and effectively. All Australians should feel comfortable in their place in our community, in our shopping centres, in our schools, and when accessing the public services that all Australians are entitled to. And as I mentioned, racism is not merely about an event or an act, but is concerned about our social system and structure. Therefore, the reactions, response, and the collective community rejection and opprobrium towards racial discrimination and racism are equally important in combating racism at its systemic and institutional level. It's not just the reactions of the victims of racial incidents, actions of bystanders, or those immediately involved with incidents that matter. It is what the rest of us feel, think, and do. And what our leaders in media and how they react in response to racist incidents that offers the best lessons and hope for a lasting change to social prejudices and discrimination in our society into the future. While we know that COVID-19 related incidents and discrimination are concerning, our current visibility of racial and racist incidents is fairly limited by our lack of data. And I've been on the forefront in advocating for better and increased capacity to collect data right across in measuring racism and racist incidents. The first issue obviously is around reporting. We know that many people who experience racism will not always report that to the authorities. The question is, which authority are we talking to that needs, that can be reported to? So why don't people do that? Because many people do not know where or how to report. Secondly, people may not appreciate the importance of reporting. And thirdly, because reporting racial abuse requires a lot of emotional effort, and victims may not be quite up to it because it's a traumatic experience for those who experience racist attacks. And the second issue is around how information is then collected and recorded and shared. And so there's no single source of data on racism in Australia, and various different agencies across many different jurisdictions receive reports right across. And I won't run through it. The Human Rights Commission does that. The state bodies do that. Police do that, and all in separate little, pockets of their own information, which aren't shared across either. And I've been advocating for the state and federal to come together and perhaps support some understanding in how we can collect this information as a national, center where information can be kept and shared properly. So we do need clear data capacity to be able to effectively have clear policy capacity in response to race incidents in this country. And a question that was posed to me secondly was, how can we share important COVID-19 messages and information to communities while being mindful of racial prejudice? Well, COVID-19, we said very early on, does not have a race. It does not discriminate or incriminate on the basis of ethnicity, gender, age, or social economic status. It is a health risk to us all. It has been said that COVID-19 is not racist, and neither should we. But we recognize from a health promotion point of view that managing and messaging what is available about COVID-19 virus is not always getting through or overcoming barriers of accessibility for various and many of the vulnerable communities. And this morning, as I was saying to Samantha, we had to deal with some of those issues surrounding COVID-19 and housing as states residents. And this is the important lesson for us, that we do not manage our multicultural communities and deal with them and work with them and supporting them in a way that will provide those capacity for equal treatment and equal access. It could easily turn into an issue that becomes what I call a racial fire that we then have to put out. We're not suggesting there's any implication that the jobs weren't done well, but it's a fine line that unless we deal with capacities to be able to deal with multicultural communities that looks into special needs and special requirements, and to fill those in a way that actually provides for capacities and empowerment in communities, we might be led to a position where situations could be exploited that turns into a race problems that we don't need to have. So very careful to ensure that we provide as much support as we can to our community. And we've done that in various ways as well. There is a link to the commission that takes you to 64 different languages on how people who might be the victim of any complaint about racism or discrimination can then share and report a complaint to the commission. And so that's one of the methods, obviously, is getting messages across the communities. We've done this in conjunction with the Home Affairs Ministry and the federal government, provide those possible access and information and education about what will be available to people who might face racism at this time. And so while there is a great deal of information out there and fact sheets, the question is, are they effective? Are they doing, are they doing the job they're meant to do in getting information across? And it's important about getting it right in that area. For me, there are 4 P's involved in any of the things we do, and much more so with ethnic communities, the first P obviously is about principles, about the broad issues, about um, the mission statements and the principle, what we stand for, what we seek to do. And obviously the second is the policy issues need to get to be right, to be able to in fact align with the principles and the mission that we have in mind. And thirdly, the programs. And then fourthly, the practices. And when we come to obviously provide programs and policies that deal with the multicultural communities, having the practices right is equally important. And that's probably is more intricate because we're dealing with multiple diverse communities with different backgrounds and different needs, and being able to get it right in that area of providing support where it counts. That's a terribly, terribly delicate and important area to get it right as well. So an emergency like the health emergency that we find ourselves, it is often the existing trust networks that are working within communities that are our best way of sharing imparting information to the community. Trust networks like the networks which, for example, the Migration Council is doing, and many others within the audience, have worked very intimately with newly arrived communities in particular. So earlier this year, I attended roundtables that were set up by Minister Ellen Touch, the Minister for Multicultural Affairs, in an attempt to liaise and obviously meet and hear from community leaders, which forms the basis of that existing trust networks to form a connection, to provide information and to hear about the needs of those communities. And it's terribly important to have that dialogue. And I will again be hosting a series of roundtables with leaders of the multicultural agencies, organizations, and members of the Chinese community. And we've also worked with SBS to make sure that they produce programs that are sensitive and aligned, obviously calibrated to provide information that is timely, that is clear, and that is effective to those communities that are in needs and are most vulnerable in a time like this. And the promotion of positive ideas is terribly important at a time like this. We're set up very early to ensure that the good works that have been done in communities, particularly the multicultural communities and migrant communities, have been told that the human stories are terribly important in a time like this, get shared right across with all Australians. So I'm very interested to hear about the positive stories about what is working well in the communities. And I'm sure you will have questions, you will have pointers, you will have experiences you will share with me, and particularly the Migration Council and the great work you do. There's so much we can learn from you, and there's so much we can adopt and obviously amplify as well to communities. No point reinventing the wheels because a lot of people are doing great stuff out there. For us is to be able to find ways to connect and coordinate a lot of the activities that's really working well out in the communities. So I appreciate the opportunities to be able to do this with you and look forward to obviously working closer with each of you who might be involved in this particular field. And lastly, the question was posed to me about sharing the mechanisms that the Commission has and how bystander can report incidents of racism. There are many complaint mechanisms. We're not the only one with the Commission that deal with complaints about race issues. Every state has a human rights body for which information obviously complaints can be made to. Different bodies in different form takes complaints in different ways. The police, for example, would take complaints on different matters that relate to crime issues. And so first and foremost, important to recognize, particularly victims of racism, that if crime has been committed, if there is matters that relate to physical violence or harassment of a nature that are criminal, in the outcomes, such assault or property damaged or any acts that are criminal in the outcome should be reported directly to the police. And in regards to complaint to the Commission, we're a little bit more obviously limited and stylized, and the kind of complaints that we capture, they relate to discrimination that are framed within the Race Discrimination Act, and they relate to the unlawfulness of discrimination in various sectors, workplace and so on and so forth, employment, education, accommodation, the access to services, accessing public services. And you can make a complaint to the commission no matter where you live. And it doesn't cost you anything to make a complaint, and you don't need a lawyer to make a complaint. The purpose behind the complaint and the format within the commission is one of conciliation and mediation. The attempt is to get people who might be aggrieved and those who might be the accused perpetrator to come together and have that difference resolved. If it can't be resolved, obviously it goes to the court system for resolution in that area. So we're not a regulatory body, we're not an enforcement body, we can't in fact punish anyone for any racist act, but the attempt is really to the complaint mechanism to find ways for people to resolve it amiably and amicably. But in terms of my role, it extends beyond that, about combating racism through education, to research, to setting the standard and making that call about activities and conduct that we as Australians do not support, that we in fact we reject as a country. So within the legislation, which is very specific about what we investigate, there are obviously limitations to where we can go. And even this morning, an attempt to reply to a matter which came on air because of a politician making remarks about housing estate residents, that obviously has racial implications. There are obviously limitations from my capacity to make direct comments on this, because the fact that complaints might follow from the incidents or from the events of today. So we would be very careful that the principle of sub judice, for example, is honored, that people come before the commission, that they will have an unbiased ear to be able to be listened to and have the matters dealt with. Some of the possible, it depends on how you look at it. It's a glass half full, or looking at this and saying, what is it that we need to do to empower the commission's role? But I think it does the job of offering, within the scope of what we are on about in this country at this stage, about looking at racism and offering it as a way of finding solutions through education, to mediation, to a way of focusing on community and attacking issues about prejudices and how to change minds. What in fact we need to improve and get to different levels of measures that deal with racism. I think it's probably something that even the Migration Council would be keen, obviously, in due course, to enter into that debate about what else we need to do to improve on the current systems we have to deal with racism. And I would also encourage people to go into our website. We have a campaign that's been going on for 7 years, Racism Starts With Me, about calling out racism, that offers clear message about racism being unacceptable. That offers training capacity or information to bystanders, offers support for victims, but offers a very clear message about what we as a society need to do to tackle racism. And so it is obviously a resource that has been very, very helpful for those who have been engaged in this area of racism and finding ways to which they can navigate and finding resources to deal with racism in a very practical way. And obviously, what is for me comforting is the fact that there is much public discussion and dialogue and discourse about racism in a way that we've never seen before. We've seen Black Lives Matters, protest. People are talking about it. We actually have organizations that would take matters into their own hands in resolving and dealing with racism within their organizations. We have had people who are, obviously counseled or dealt with organizations who for racist conduct and behavior that was very rare in the past. And so there is this awareness and consciousness that I felt is an important addition to all the work that the government organizations or bodies like the Migration Councils do, that there is a public and collective community understanding of the need to take actions and to have in the sense of accountability about what they do. And so for me, that's very pleasing. And what can you do in addition to that? Well, support initiatives out there that are obviously aimed at combating racism. Write in the papers, express your views, share in that forum, which might be dominated by those who hold different views. To have the capacity to have a say and to be able to, in fact, uh, control the narrative is terribly important as well to getting the message right across about what we as a society do or do not accept. And important to remember as well that calling out racism is equally important. And of course, assuming it's safe to do so, to be able to deal with the issues of racism, as we've said before, racism thrives in the areas where we fail to say no to it. And for me, in the issues of Asian Australian racism and the incidents that happened, for me, it is to understand that we need to canvass broadly a collective sense of rejection. It is not just what the bystander or the families of the victims of racism felt at that moment and the reactions they have. It is the reaction of all of us who weren't there that count equally. It is about the reaction of, the chaps who sit in a pub and have a drink, assuming they do social distancing, obviously at a time like this. And what they say and how they talk about these events and how they, in fact, support the victims and reject racism. These are the compounding factors that make us a society that will ultimately find the changes we need. So it's not simply about this incident. There will always be some incidents into the future, but it's what we do, the 99.9% react, and the way we, in fact, embraced our inclusive nature of the community we lived in as a far more reflection of where we go in making changes to our community. And I'm going to finish very shortly because I'd like to have an opportunity to take some questions as well. The other powerful way to combat racism is by breaking down the barriers that exist between different ethnic groups within our community. And by that, I don't mean just, those that will come from certain parts of the world. For me, multiculturalism in here in Australia means everyone, European, Anglo background, Australians from all parts of the world. And this is the one collective tent. I always said that multiculturalism has got one tent only, and we are in it. No one is left out there. And so it's important to be able to share and engage at that level because by doing so, by generating greater understanding of each other and increase social harmony, we reduce those racial prejudices we talked about, where people are thinking and feeling in a certain way. And that level of discomfort about reaching out and having interpersonal relationship with people from different background, we need to break that down if there's any barrier that exists in those areas. And they will act collectively to, in fact, strengthen our understanding of race issues and how to be more inclusive. And that's terribly important to get that in place. I've said to the multicultural communities and to the leaders and to the organizations, if you do your job well, I will less to do in my area in terms of the race issues to deal with. Terribly important to align that. And we've said as well that social cohesion and racism are two sides of the same coin. You couldn't do one without the other. We need to be able to find ways to provide for a more socially cohesive and harmonious community if we're going to be able to reduce racism. And I'll finish off very quickly by just simply referring to some of the general difficulties we have about racism in its current place. So fighting racial equality always is going to be a tough job. It's a tough road, especially in the era of denials, indifference, arrogance, and deflections. We've seen some of that more recently. Unlike previous times when racism is mostly, overtly enshrined in laws, now it is more likely to exist in systemic and subtle forms. Robust, violent, and nasty interpersonal occurrences and the experiences of racism are seen as the exception rather than a rule for some racial and ethnic minority groups, even in this country. To Eddie S. Glord, Jr., the distinguished university professor at Princeton University and the author of the book, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. He said the naked racism of the previous generation that we thought was banished may not necessarily mean that prejudice was stripped from a national discourse. It had simply shifted and given way to concerns about crime and affirmative actions. He alluded to coded speech and racial dog whistles that allowed Janus-faced politicians to decry bigotry in one moment while exploiting hatred and fear in another. And he spoke about the softened tone that obscured what still lurked beneath about beliefs of who belonged and who the country belonged to. In many ways, this makes the current fight against racism all the more challenging, and persistence with sophistication is even far more important than before. So in supporting the need for the work we do, we give primary education as well, as it remains a powerful tool to combat racism, whether through formal anti-racism learning and training programs in school education system or as a general education awareness program or campaign. And that is why we're committed to pursuing a national anti-racism strategy to combat racism and to promote understanding, acceptance, and compliance with the Racial Discrimination Act. And when racial discrimination occurs and racist events take place, we must seek to ensure that the responses, measures, and legal remedies and provisions that exist are responsive, appropriate, and are strong in attacking unacceptable racial conduct, behavior, and acts. And in the case of racist extremism that are often violent in nature, we must ensure that our laws, particularly our criminal laws and legal sanctions, are strengthened in order to arrest and apprehend these criminal acts and conduct. Now, I want to add a couple of last messages. One being that Australia is a multiracial, multicultural society. The message of inclusion and equality will remain unchanged and strong and vibrant. It will withstand the challenges and test of time. And secondly, there is no place for racism, racial or religious bigotry, prejudice, discrimination, or hate in this country or anywhere. And thirdly, we must all draw the line against racial and religious bigotry, prejudice, discrimination, and hatred. And we will do so not because it is convenient, socially, or politically expedient, but because it's the right thing to do and because it is the answer to harmony and peace in our society. And we must draw the line, hold ourselves accountable. And we will do so with ourselves, our families, our friends, our workmates, and our colleagues, in our associations and clubs, with our community, our organizations, our workplaces, in the media, government, and authorities, and with our leaders, elected officials, and parliamentarians. And we will hold ourselves and each other accountable for what we do and do not do in confronting racism and race hate. So Samantha, thank you very much. I think I got another 2 hours to go, but I probably won't bore you with what I've said. I'm happy to continue that discussion and let people have a say in this and take that to perhaps, a different place as well if we need to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Commissioner, for sharing that, and definitely far from boring. I think most of the attendees would agree with me that that was very insightful and an important dialogue for us to be having. So thank you so much. We will now open up for questions. So if you can please send any questions through the question box. We've also received some already through, so I'll get started with them, Commissioner, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
So one of the first questions that we've received is, Commissioner, you mentioned a lack of data at a national level.
Yeah.
Are there any evaluations or research at either, a national level or international that identify the most effective strategies to reduce racism?
We've had some discussions with some academics about looking at some of the I suppose, methods of dealing with that, and there are various methods out there. I was giving different models of very fanciful names as well. Some are American-based, mostly. The Americans are very good at collecting data, but how to use it is something else. But the point is that it's available somewhere. It's imperfect, and we need to find ways of dealing with data collection that is unique to us. That obviously offers us the best possible solution. So the short answer is there are snatches of different things out there. But no one has come up with obviously an answer that we can replicate immediately and say this is what we want to do. But to be fair, there are issues in this country that we need to deal with in terms of federal concept and states-based and police. I mean, we couldn't get police to give us things they don't want to give us information because we have no jurisdictional capacity to compel any of that. And even to be fair, in the federal government, federal police, we don't have any rights to compel any of this information. So, but what we do need is obviously an agreement right across the country of saying the measures, what we want to measure. And this is the conversation we're having about what do we need to do here in this country. What are the information I need to allow us and you, and for example, Migration Council, to have access to that will allow you to draw on policy issues of providing support for communities. So we want that, and this is the beginning of a conversation about what we're doing. And I'm looking forward to exploring this in a more, I suppose, structured way of saying let's get some sort of study going about what is possible of dialogues and consultation with communities, and say, look, these are the framework, and what else do we need to get it going? And so I hope to have that in place, by next year, to have some understanding about what we need to get this job done.
Wonderful, thanks, Commissioner. Related to that, we have a question here saying, what does the data look like in regional areas? And is regional racism any different to that's seen in the cities?
Again, the information isn't there. We don't want to collect for state-based and much less about regional. In Australian kind of social setting, we are very obviously sensitive to some of those issues, and I don't think we're up to monitoring at that level. And even when it exists, and we talk about regional, the form of the manifestation of racism may be a bit different in the way it's experienced by someone in a suburban area. It might be about services more than about anything else. And again, the number of I suppose people who might travel and live in regional Australia who are from different background may not be fully I suppose the numbers may not be fully actually explored in terms of what are we talking about, who we're dealing with, and which regional areas are we referring to about that sort of data. So the short answer is no, we don't have data in that particular area. Do I want to see that happening? I'd like to have comprehensive data right across that will give us a sense of the pulse of that race issues in this country. And it doesn't have to be just about race. It could be a social cohesion sense of how we fare in any part of Australia and what needs to be done to augment or support the needs of some of those communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner. I've got a couple of questions to do with the media. I'll just pick one of them. What steps can be taken against vilification of specific groups in the media?
That's one of the price we pay in a free country, isn't it, Samantha? That's been said to me time and again. We're going to balance, the rights of free speech, and it's a good thing because we're a free, open country. We're democratic. That's what we do. But that carries with it also the burden of having that balanced more intricately, looked into and dealt with. Media, one of the biggest complaints that comes through, not to the formal channel, even though we do have cases that deals with media, has been the unequal or unfair treatment of communities by media, the misconstrued, misapprehended, and the mischievous reporting that have a way of encouraging, inciting certain attitudes. Is it there? Yeah, of course it's there. There are limits to what we can do. We can talk to media, we can rebut some of the things they say, challenge them. But I like to have the capacity to obviously work through with the press council, for example, the industry bodies about setting some norms and standards about behavior in this particular area. And it's not new. I mean, there are reporting and reporters and the whole ethics and lines of self-regulation do deal with issues that pertain to, for example, domestic violence, or issues that pertain to suicide. Are very carefully dealt with, and there is a very nuanced capacity for media to understand the need for care when they generate news or information in those areas. I like to have that, if nothing else, a sense of that pressed awareness of responsibility in this particular area. So we're still working on it, and I'll be very keen to pursue any sort of opportunities I can with the press council to have it dealt internally with their industry to deal with that. But I think the important thing about the press from the community's perspective is to keep challenging it, but you have to. If things are said or statements are made that are incorrect, there's a way, in fact, inflaming an issue. I think it's important for the community at large to be able to say that there's something unacceptable and to correct the impressions, but also sending a message to obviously the press platforms that the conduct and the activities are not appreciated or acceptable to them as well. So it's an ongoing issue. We've had an attorney general before in the past who says that people have a right to be bigots, and so, well, they may have, but it's something we don't think they should be. And it's not, something we should have learned to be happy about or appreciate, but we need to deal with it. And then the question is, what responsibilities and roles the media have? And I think there's a fair bit of responsibility that needs to be challenged, that they need to, in fact, take up to be able to fulfill the role in ensuring that we provide for a careful, nuanced capacity to work through a inclusive and harmonious society.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner. Next question is, we've seen a renewed focus on casual racism targeted at individuals, but our systems and institutions have also come under the light. Commissioner, what are your thoughts on that?
Casual racism, it's on that end of racial prejudices that we talked about. It's the case of that Korean gentleman to called for an Uber, and then Uber arriving refused to take him because they felt he was Chinese and was carrying the virus. Obviously there are remedies available if we can obviously follow through. The culprit who was the driver of Uber, you can actually address that through the Race Discrimination Act. But a lot of that is that subtle indifference, that attitude that is a flickle of the eye, or an attitude, or a kind of I suppose a reflection that people might give you that relates to a sense of not belonging or being a part of a community, based on nothing more that inflection about who you are. We've dealt with race, casual discrimination quite extensively to the work we do with the Racism Starts With Me, and there's a whole section that deals with casual racism. I think the important thing about casual racism is this: it's about people's understanding or thoughts and people's sense of, I suppose, attitudes about certain issues. And when it comes to conversation, it's important that the rest of the community are able to challenge or to deal with those conversations. And we're finding that's happening increasingly. We ran a televised program the last quarter that featured Adam Goods. It's interesting. One of the lessons for me that highlights where we've gone and how far we moved ahead is the fact 6 years ago, most people didn't see it as being racist. there wasn't a racial incident. It simply reflected someone who had a personal view about certain things. And 6 years down the track, with AFL saying we should have seen it, it was racist. And so for me, the important element in all of this is our sense of awareness and how far we moved from certain positions where we are now. And it calls for continuing programs or obviously conversation to improve the understanding of what is it that we're talking about when we're dealing with racism. Asian Australians, for example, are taking that a little bit further. Asian Australians are now voicing the views that while they have done well in this country 200 years and they're largely been quite accepted, but the area where they are challenging would be in the area of participation in leadership, in areas of representation. I'm saying there aren't enough, for example, Asians to be given access to leadership roles in this country, when in fact the corporate sectors in the political arenas. And so they're challenging that as a new area for which they say, I think that's an important element of breaking down more barriers towards racism. And most of that area is casual racism. If you want to characterize it, it's been the way people find or not find the opportunities for people to progress based on different reasons, and a lot of that is based on a cultural and religious and racial background as well of people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Commissioner. Next question. I believe you've touched on this a bit before, but can you please provide any strategies that civilian community can use to systematically confront racism coming from people in power and privileged positions?
That's a difficult one to deal with. You're dealing with that sort of both the casual racism area and the systemic institutional based racism. One of the things that I've said very early in my term that we need to look at in terms of the theaters of operation is the four cardinals of that compass. One is the constitutional area, which reflects to me what the laws are, RDA and all of that. The convention sets the standards and the bar. And secondly, the institutional aspects, what institutions do or don't do, and how they do things, in particular, and exposing and removing barriers for which people of different backgrounds can advance and be treated equally. And thirdly, the area of narrative, very important. That's media area, what we say or what we don't say. And sometimes politicians say too much, and and they say the wrong things too. And fourthly, the area of the community is a terribly important area to work in, as we've seen now, for example, with the COVID-19, working with the community. So in terms of breaking down the systemic barriers that are there, you need to be able to rattle the cages or the gates on the outside, but equally you need to have those changes coming from the inside as well. And it will take the reflection of a lot of people, not just from multicultural background in that sense, but even from Anglo-European background. And I was reading a book. It talks about the white privilege. It was written by a white professor anyway. So, trying to explore the notion of white privilege and his conclusion that it exists, however you want to frame it. And he said the conclusion for him was this: that the real changes that comes about making changes and making sure that people have opportunities and that there's this diversity and inclusion is what happens in what he called the white spaces. It's when people come together and they're from one ethnic group, and largely, and what the system is about, that hierarchy is largely what he called the white area. And it's when the white people sit there and they talk about things like, oh, what's happening here? Why do they, and someone asks a question, why is it that they're all like me, right? And why isn't there that diversity? And then says, that's where the real big changes come through, because it is done at a level which materially matters and makes it easier for changes to occur, because it's opening doors from the inside and not barging in from the outside. And so if you have the opportunity and your reflections about these things, then you need to sit back and say, what can I do to make those changes in places that people might have the opportunity? It might take a longer time to try and break through to make those changes, but where the inner reflection would be about how can we change it on the inside? How can we today change the rules, to let people in that otherwise might happen? And they're a very powerful capacity for us all to understand the roles we play that seeks to break the system down, and little bits at a time. Australia is not big on revolutions. We haven't had a revolution for anything, to be fair. When we went to lockdown to become a white country in the 1900s, we used the Immigration Act to do that. And when we became a multicultural country and abandoned the white policy in the 90s, in the 70s, again, we just tweaked the immigration policies to do that. So a lot of what we do is very functional in a sense about making changes. And so every one of us in the field which we're involved with, in fact, it's inside or outside, have a role to play to make those subtle conscious changes.
Absolutely. Thanks, Commissioner. I'm just mindful of the time, so I'll just take another 2 questions. So apologies if we missed out on your question today. This one says that a common question we receive as a service provider is, will reporting help the situation? If people report, what is the process? And will they get feedback if there's any action taken?
But it depends on what you're reporting on and whether in fact it's a report to us or someone else. I can't answer for anyone else, but when we do have a process in place and people ask report, obviously we're trying to respond to that as much as we can. But can I say that you might get satisfaction for each of the matters you report on, because there are limitations, and even governments have limitations. But the point would be this: it will add collectively to the information we have that will serve as a very important element to provide a case for which we can advocate some issues. So without that, it simply means I don't have the resources to be able to point to anyone to advocate for any measures that I might be proposing. And we get it all the time. I get counterparts in different sections of government saying, can you tell me what are the data on this? Can you tell me how many complaints have come through? So our advocacy, for example, National Anti-Racism Campaign strategy, people saying, do we need it? Why? Who is saying that we need it? Please provide some details. If government's going to fund it, where are the evidence to support that? So what it does is this reports adds up as evidence-based information data that allows, to, if nothing else, understand what's happening and to advocate for changes through there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Commissioner. Last question. So in your opinion, will we ever be able to stop racism, and how do we do this?
Well, that's a big question. I don't believe you can eradicate racism. If you look at racism for what we define it to be, it's prejudices of people. I wasn't born in this country. I was born overseas, actually, in the country up in the north. It might be an Asian country, but sometimes we look at racism as a black and white issue. Simply, the white folks and the non-white folks, and racism is there. Of course, it's there, and a lot of that it's caught up in that power equilibrium as well. But in different ways, in different measures, racism exists in all parts of the world. Even up in Asian countries, and so we're not immune from that. The only question I have is this: as a country in Australia, how do we move forward to frame ourselves as a country where, when we talk about equality, when we had, since 1975, under law says that racial discrimination is unlawful, right? We're still, in many ways, struggling to understand and implement that and apply it. So the will is there, and then people actually understand the human rights issues about not being racist and being equal. It's the practice that comes through, and a lot of that will be about the way, in fact, we look at our lives and the values we have, and to make those differences that would change the way we look at the issues that we value. One of the things that, Samantha, that's important for me in giving me the motivation every day in doing my job, because someone said, look, it's a tough job, man. It's like Ali and ON,
You know, you fix one problem, the next one pops up. So why do you keep doing that? And you're never going to solve racism. Well, you know, the point for me to matter is this: I wake up every morning and I reflect on this, you know, and it's a truism. No child is born a racist. No one is. I don't care if it's black, white, you know, or yellow. No one is. They got it somewhere, and if they got it somewhere, we can stop it, or we can, if they have it, we can. If they're trained, we can untrain them. Right? And that for me offers that hope that there is a better world which kids were born. It shouldn't be this world we lived in. Right? And I don't have all the answers, and no one will. We're saying, how do we fix some of the problems we have? And it will start from parenting, it will start from schools, it will start from the peers, it will start, you know, from the workplaces. But we all have the responsibility. I talk about accountability, we're all accountable. What do I teach my kids? And how I reflect on racist incidents are important because it sends a clear message. Right? So at the end of the day, we'll find there be less incidents of race and race incidents out there if we're able to get to a position where people don't feel that they need, or that this is not the way in which they react to certain issues. Because if we leave race out of this, I think we're in a better place.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Commissioner. And I think that was wonderful to end on that, that great sense of hope that we can be the change and make the change. We greatly appreciate you sharing your thoughts and invaluable insights today, in addition to your leadership as the Race Discrimination Commissioner. I think we just need to keep this dialogue going. Thank you all so much for participating. Thank you so much for your time again, Commissioner.
Thank you all.
Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you,
Commissioner. Stay safe and, enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.